Hi, I'm Alex Pope, and this is the TruBlue Speed service training video. First, we're going to start by checking the torque on both our spring side and gear side shaft nuts. We'll do so using the 47 Newton meter torque wrench. Then we're going to turn the device on its side with the spring side facing upward. We're going to start by doing an inspection around the perimeter of the cover plate that you can see within the device to make sure that all of the perimeter screws are in place. And then we're going to do a gear hitch test. That's just to listen to anything within the device that may be out of place or rubbing on another component. Next, we're going to start by removing the housing bolts and security bolt. Next, we're going to inspect the inside of the housing around the nozzle area for any debris. This device is very clean, so requires very minimal cleaning. We also, at this point, want to inspect for any potential cracking within the housing. Next, we're going to remove the isolation insert and inspect this by folding it inside out. If there are any cracks or cuts on the isolation insert, you want to go ahead and replace that piece. Next, we're going to remove the shaft nut. Remove the housing insert, inspect the edges of this plate and the inside where the shaft nut sits for any damage. Next, we'll remove the cover plate spacer. I'm going to look for any wear on the top or bottom edges. This would only happen in a case where the housing insert would potentially be pinched between the insert and the cover plate. Next, we'll bring the arm down to secure the device in place, and we will remove the roller and roller pin. Sometimes removing the roller pin can be tricky, so we'll use a hammer to kind of break it loose. There we go. And we'll clean the pin off of any dust or debris and reassemble that. Then we can start by pulling the nozzle halves apart, setting those aside. And now we can remove our webbing assembly. Next, we will remove our shackle pin. Set the webbing to the side. We want to try to avoid stepping on the webbing if at all possible. And then we will release the tension from our webbing pin and guide the webbing or the short webbing loop back into place. And TruBlue speeds retract very quickly, so at this time we'll let the spring drum unwind while controlling its speed, just putting pressure on the cover plate. Now that that's done, you can release the arm. Prior to inspection of the TruBlue Speed retraction spring, one thing that we want to keep in mind is the TruBlue Speed, whether it's the 12.5 meter device or 16 meter device, will require the retraction spring to be replaced every 5 years. So the way that we're going to keep track of this is by keeping a mark or using a paint pen to mark the cover plate with the year, with how old the retraction spring actually is. So as you can see on this cover plate, there are no markings. So this year would be the first year of use of this spring in the field. So for example, if you service a device that had a 4 on the cover plate, that would signify that this spring needs to be replaced during the service of that year. Keep in mind, every time the spring is replaced or during service of the device the second year around, you would want to obviously clean the 1 off of that cover plate and reassign a 2 to that specific device. In doing so, this will ensure that the retraction springs are replaced when they need to be. And now we are going to remove the 5 PSD cover plate perimeter screws. And then before just removing the plate, you'd like to, for security, want to slide your hand underneath the cover plate. And then once you've done that, you can remove the plate. This is just to ensure that the spring is secure and isn't going to surprise you. Next, we are going to inspect the inside of the PSD and around the PSD inner screws for any cracking or any damage. Same with the retraction spring nut. We'll check for any cracking around that area. And at this time would be a good time also to inspect the spring bands for any damage, severe discoloration, excessive spacing from the shaft, or any creasing that may occur. Once you have done that, we can check the torque on all 3 inner screws. We'll check those with 2.5 Newton meter torque wrench. And we will check the retraction spring nut as well, also with 2.5 Newton meter torque wrench. Once that is done and you have done all of your inspections, you can reinstall the cover plate and reinstall all 5 perimeter screws. You'll notice at this point I don't screw the screw all the way down. I do it about 3/4 of the way. This is just to make sure that the plate stays aligned. And on the last screw, we will go ahead and screw this one all the way down and go back and finish the rest. Now, before we wind this drum, we're going to do our short webbing loop inspections as well as our guide band inspection. So what we're going to do now is by reaching into the device and pressing on the inside of the guide band, we can press it outward. This allows us to inspect the top edge of our guide band, and then we can press that back into place. We'll do the same thing on the other side. This is to inspect for any sharp edges or corrosion. After we've done that, we will look to the inside of the device to inspect our short webbing loop. We'll inspect the top edge first, and then the bottom edge. This is also a good time to check for any debris or potential gouges or scrapes on the guide plates that could potentially cause damage to the webbing. Now that we've done our inspection on the short webbing loop, guide band, and guide plates, we can now proceed with winding our spring back up. At this time, you want to make sure to not pinch any of the bosses on the PSD or the retention nut. Excessive pressure on those points will cause damage or potential cracking to the PSD itself. Okay, once we've reached the end of the spring, I'll let go of the winder and reach in between the guide plates to feel for the short webbing loop. And then we'll pull the short webbing loop out of the device, put our pin in place. Next, we will install our shackle. Before we install our test webbing, we need to inspect our regular webbing. To do so, we will start at the carabiner end of the webbing. We will start by twisting the carabiner, making sure that it can twist and spin on its own. And then we will make sure that the gate can lock under its own power. Next, we will start by inspecting the loop that the carabiner is sewn through, making sure that there's no fray around these points. And then we will inspect the rest of the hand grip. And we will inspect the bar tack, making sure that none of the stitches are loose. And then we will inspect the rest of the nylon webbing. For the TruBlue speed devices, we are going to install a 7.5 meter test webbing. As well as a standard TruBlue nozzle. During the reinstallation process, you can also use the original shackle pin. You only need to use a new shackle pin with Loctite when reinstalling the webbing that will be used in the field. Then we'll release the tension from our pin and let the webbing back into the device. And try not to let the webbing knot up like I did. Okay. Now that the webbing is installed, we can release the security arm. We can reinstall our cover plate spacer, our housing insert, and our isolation insert, and we can reinstall our spring side housing half. And we'll torque the shaft nut to 47 Newton meters. The housing bolt and security bolt will be torqued to 18 Newton meters. Okay, so now that we've completed the service of the 12.5 meter TruBlue speed device, we are going to start with the spring side service on the 16 meter TruBlue. The gear side is the same between the two, so in this portion we will only be covering the spring side and the webbing assemblies. Same as the 12.5 meter, we'll start by checking the torque on the shaft nuts. And then we'll turn the device so the spring side is facing upward. We'll inspect and make sure that all of the perimeter screws are in place on the cover plate. And now we will do a gear hitch test. Okay. And now we will start by removing the security bolt, housing bolts, and the shaft nut. We'll perform the same inspections within the housing to ensure that there's no debris or minimal debris around the nozzle ports, and inspect the housing for any cracking. And then we'll remove the isolation insert, performing the same inspections that we did previously. Remove the housing insert, the cover plate spacer, and then we'll bring the bench arm to secure the device. Move the roller and the roller pin. Separate the two nozzle halves. And begin to remove the webbing. So one thing you'll notice as you remove your main webbing lanyard is that the 16-meter TruBlue device has a long webbing spacer internally. So different from the short webbing loop spacer that most of you are familiar working with, this one is significantly longer. So what we need to do at this point is let the spring unwind. So once the spring is unwound, we can release the arm. And then as we mentioned previously, we want to, if the device does not have a numbered mark on the cover of the plate, that would signify that this would be the first year that the spring has been in the field in use. And then we will go ahead and remove the perimeter screws. Slip our hand under the cover plate to secure the spring. And then we'll perform the same checks as we did previously. One thing you will notice between the standard 12.5 meter TruBlue speed and the 16 meter is they utilize different retraction springs. The 16 meter uses the TruBlue speed specific retraction spring, as opposed to the 12.5 meter that uses the standard TruBlue retraction spring. From this point, we will perform the same inspections as we did previously. We'll start by looking for any cracking around the inner screws or around the inside of the device or drum in general, and also inspect by the retraction spring nut on the outside of the spring drum. Once you've verified that there is no cracking or damage to the interior of the PSD, we will check the torque on all three inner screws. And check the torque on the spring nut as well. So now that that has been done, to wind the long webbing spacer on the 16 meter device, what we need to do is actually remove the center spring arbor from the shaft. What this allows us to do is put the cover plate back on to make sure that the spring is secure, and it will allow us to rotate the PSD without putting any force or unnecessary tension on the actual spring itself. So now that we've checked the torque on our three PSD inner screws and our retraction spring nut on the outside of the drum, and inspected our spring as well, we can go ahead and place the cover plate back onto the device and install a minimum of 3 PSD perimeter screws to secure the cover plate in place. And then at this time we will remove the long webbing spacer. And at this point, this allows us now to inspect the part of the long webbing spacer that is still attached to the hub, do our guide band inspections, and reset the long webbing spacer. So I'll go ahead and inspect our guide band. a look into the device, inspecting the top edge and bottom edge of the long webbing spacer, as well as inspecting the surfaces of the guide plates for any debris. And now we can let the long webbing spacer, or wind it back into the device. This part will need to be done manually as the spring arbor has been unhooked from the shaft. Now that the short webbing loop has been reinstalled, we can remove the perimeter screws. Reinstall the center of the spring, and now completely reinstall the cover plate and all 5 perimeter screws. And now we can rewind the spring. During the winding of the spring, you want to make sure that the long webbing spacer stays in place and does not begin to come out of the device. And then once the spring has been wound, you'll find the end of the drum lead or long webbing spacer, and we'll pin the loop outside of the device and bring the arm down to secure the core. At this point, we are ready to install our 7.5 meter test line. And once the test line is secured through the shackle and shackle pin, we'll release the tension from our webbing pin and let the webbing back into the device. Once the webbing is in the device, we will go ahead and install our test nozzle. And once the nozzle is in place, we can release the arm and begin to reinstall the cover plate spacer, the housings insert, the isolation insert, and our spring side housing half. And we can install the shaft nut and torque down all the housing bolts and security bolt as well. Okay, so different from the 12.5 meter TruBlue speed webbing assembly, we have the 16 meter webbing assembly. This webbing is obviously different from the all black nylon that we had in the 12.5 meter device, similar to the differences between TruBlue and TruBlue XL devices. The inspection itself though will stay exactly the same, starting with the carabiner. Ensuring that the carabiner swivels properly and that the gate locks smoothly and properly. Next, we'll also inspect the loop where the carabiner is attached, ensuring that there's no fray. And then we will inspect our hand grip, the face of the hand grip along with the edges. And then we'll move on to the bar tack, ensuring that none of the stitches are popped, and then we will inspect the remainder of the webbing. Okay, now that we have the housing bolts and shaft nut torqued, we can flip the device over to the gear side. You'll notice right off the bat, the gear side of the TruBlue Speed device looks significantly different from all of our other devices. We'll start by removing the security bolt, the shaft nut, and then the 4 housing bolts. Same as we did on the spring side of the device. Now that the security bolt, housing bolts, and shaft nut are removed, we can remove our gear side housing half. Same as the spring side, we'll inspect the area around where the nozzle is installed for any debris, and inspect the rest of the housing visually for any cracking or damage. Next, we'll remove the isolation insert, and we'll do the same inspection that we did on the spring side of the device by folding the insert, trying to look for any cracks or cuts. Next, we will remove the one-way idler. And we'll start by cleaning the gear side of the device of any grease or debris that may be in place. Spray some alcohol on here. On the TruBlue Speed device, there are a handful of components on the gear side that are you'll notice are significantly different in their design. This was to remove weight from the gear side of the device. With that being said, you'll notice beneath the drum gear there is a little bit of space between the magnet plate and the gear itself. You want to be sure to, while you're cleaning this side of the device, to try to wipe a brush or a rag underneath that to remove any excessive grease or debris that could be stuck. And we'll spray this side down with alcohol as well. Okay, after we've cleaned the gear side of the device as well as the idler, we can start our checks on the drum gear bolts, the rotor, and our idler. First, we'll start with the drum gear bolts. So on TruBlue speed devices, the drum gear bolts are torqued to 15 Newton meters instead of 9. So you just need to make sure that your wrench is calibrated. Okay. Now that those have been checked, we will start by doing our deployment checks on our rotor arms. During this time, we want to deploy the arms as much as we can using a flathead screwdriver. This is to make sure that the rotor arms are deploying smoothly and retracting back into place. Next, we will feel for all of the magnets on the device. We'll start by pressing inward on the back side of all of the magnets, ensuring that they are all still in place and that none of the magnets are loose. And then we will inspect the underside of the rotor, ensuring that all 6 star locks holding the reaction springs in place are still in their proper position. Now that we've completed the cleaning of the gear side of the device, we're going to begin the inspection on our idler assembly. To begin the inspection, we're going to hold on to the idler assembly housing and spin the large gear. If the large gear does not spin freely, replace the one-way idler assembly. Hold the large gear still and spin the small gear in a clockwise direction. If the small gear does not spin freely, it would also need to be replaced. Next, we're going to hold the large gear and still try to turn the small gear in a counterclockwise direction. As you can see, this is very difficult. Or if the small gear does spin counterclockwise, you'll need to replace the one-way idler assembly. In addition to that, we will also spin the small gear a half turn. After you've spun the small gear a half turn, check again and make sure that the small gear does not spin counterclockwise. Next step is going to be to remove the small circlip on the top of the one-way idler assembly. To do so, we'll use the retaining ring pliers to remove the small clip. We'll remove this piece, set that to the side. Keep in mind, once the small circlip has been removed from the idler, when you go to reinstall after the inspection has been completed, the small circlip will need to be replaced. To remove the idler bearing, we're going to attempt to use our magnetic bearing tool. This will allow us to pull the bearing without having to damage the outer race of the bearing. If you are able to remove the bearing using this magnetic tool, you do not need to replace the bearing. So to do so, we'll place the magnet over the center of the bearing and we'll listen for a clicking sound. If you hear the clicking sound, that means the bearing has contacted the magnet and is free to be removed. In this case, we are not able to remove it, so we'll set this tool to the side and we will grab our bearing puller. This puller has an edge towards the bottom of the tool. This edge here will actually, once we remove our bearing shield, will allow us to insert this into the bearing, expand the two jaws of the bearing puller, and remove the bearing. Our first step is going to be to pull this top bearing shield off using a small pick. If you need to remove the bearing shield during the idler inspection, the bearing must be replaced. We'll set that to the side, and now we can use our bearing puller. We'll place this within the bearing and tighten down this wing nut. And now we should be able to pull the bearing out of the idler assembly. Prior to inspecting the internals of the one-way idler assembly, ensure that the pin protruding from the inspection tool has not been bent or broken. Next, we are going to insert the one-way idler inspection tool into the cavity within the one-way idler, as you can see right here. There are 3 of these points within the one-way idler, and each of these will need to be inspected. First, we will insert the one-way idler inspection tool into the idler, making sure that once it is fully seated, the red O-ring is not visible. Next, we will flip the one-way idler over with the inspection tool held firmly in place. We'll still hold the large gear while rotating the small gear in a clockwise direction. The small gear should jam and stop rotating in both directions. If the small gear continues to turn clockwise, the one-way idler needs to be replaced. Next, we will move the pin on the one-way idler to a next inspection point. Making sure it is fully seated, we'll perform the same checks once again. We'll rotate the small gear, ensuring that it stops and locks into place and is not able to spin in either direction. Then we will repeat the step for a 3rd time. We'll rotate the small gear, ensuring it locks in place and does not continue to spin. Once the inspection has been completed, ensure to replace the cap back onto the inspection tool to prevent any damage to the pin. Next, we will need to reapply grease to the 3 points within the one-way idler. Once you have reapplied grease within the idler assembly, we'll reinstall a new idler support bearing by pressing it in and making sure that it's fully seated. Next, we will reinstall a new small circlip to the top of the idler support pin. Make sure that once you have installed the clip and removed the pliers, that the clip has been fully seated into its proper position. Next, we will repeat the first steps that we covered during this inspection process. We will hold the large gear and spin the small gear in a clockwise direction. If the small gear does not spin freely, try replacing the small support bearing once again, or discard the one-way idler assembly. Next, we will repeat the small gear counterclockwise test by holding onto the large gear and trying to turn the small gear in a counterclockwise direction. There shouldn't be any movement. Next, we will advance the small gear a half turn and attempt to move it clockwise once again. If the small gear rotates in a counterclockwise direction, the one-way idler assembly needs to be replaced. Given that all of the checks within the one-way idler assembly go smoothly, we have now completed the inspection of the one-way idler. So next we are going to re-grease the drum gear on the gear side of the device. And grease the rotor gear as well. And then these are just marks that we put over our drum gear bolts. These just let us know for QC purposes that we have torqued these bolts to their proper torque specification. And next year when you get the device back in for service, if the line doesn't match up with the line on the gear, you know that the bolt itself has become slightly loose and needs to be retorqued. Now that we've re-greased the drum gear, the inspection is completed with the idler assembly, we can go ahead and reinstall the idler assembly back into the device. Okay, now that the idler assembly is installed, we will install our isolation insert, making sure that this is fully seated and there's no space, or that the isolation insert is not sitting higher than the surface of the idler plate. And we will go ahead and reinstall our roller assembly as well. To do so, I'll pull on the nozzle and webbing, creating more room for me to install the roller assembly. And just to make sure that the roller pin is seated, we'll just give it a tap with the hammer and let the webbing back into place. And lastly, we will reinstall the gear side housing half. And reinstall the shaft nut, security bolt, and housing bolts. And we'll torque the shaft nut to 47 Newton meters, and each of the housing bolts and security bolt to 18 Newton meters. Okay, now that we have reinstalled the test webbing, what we're going to do before we have completed the service and prior to testing, we are going to do our core alignment check. So to do this, we are actually going to remove the nozzle clip and the nozzle halves. And we are going to check and make sure that the core of the device is properly aligned. In doing so, the webbing will be centered on the roller assembly itself, and the guide plates on the underside of the plastic drum and the cast drum should be spaced evenly within the device. And we would also like to make sure that the roller assembly is spinning freely and isn't getting caught on either housings. After we've completed that step, we can reinstall our nozzle To do so, we'll put the bottom half of the nozzle clip into the nozzle body and squeeze the clip and push it into place. We will install the top half of the nozzle clip, or the nozzle assembly first, and then the bottom half. Press them together and push the clip back into place. Now that we have completed our internal component inspections, proceed with descent and retraction testing according to the manual. Now that testing is completed, we need to reinstall our regular webbing assembly. First, we will remove the nozzle clip. And using our nozzle clip, we will pull the top nozzle half or nozzle body off, as well as the bottom half, and remove our test webbing. We will then pin our long webbing spacer to the device. And we'll remove our old shackle pin. Now we will reinstall our 16-meter webbing with a new shackle pin. Release the tension from the pin and let the webbing back into the device. Remember to pull on the webbing intermittently throughout the reinstallation of the webbing to prevent any or to prevent uneven webbing stack. And now we will reinstall our single piece nozzle. First we will put this bottom half in. With the single piece nozzle, it kind of requires you to wedge the two halves into place. This can be a little bit tricky. Here we go. And now our webbing installation is complete. Now that testing is complete and descent and retraction times have been recorded, as well as the regular webbing assembly being installed, we have now completed service on a TruBlue Speed device.